So welcome everybody to the Peter Maxwell Davies Research Network. It's lovely to see everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nick Jones, and I co-curate the network together with Richard McGregor. As you can see, Richard, he's going to give us a little wave, or not. There he is. That's great. So this is the first Friday forum of this academic year. And all the other ones have been recorded. So if you are interested, you can view those on our YouTube channel. So today's session is going to be chaired by Richard. So without further ado, over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Nick. Welcome, everyone. Our two speakers today, well, we hope, as Gillian comes, have really impressive CVs. So it's quite difficult to decide what to leave in and what to leave out. But without any further ado, I'll introduce Ian Ritchie. And many of you will be familiar with him. What I didn't know is that Ian started off as a solo singer, but got seduced by administration. It's a sad loss to the singing world, Ian, I think.
And I don't call it administration really either.
Well, I had to think of a word that actually covered it.
I know. Yeah, fair enough.
Anyway, he began as in Universal Edition, and from there moved in 1979 to be general manager of what was then called the Richard Hickox Singers and Orchestra, and then became the City of London Symphonia. There's a large number of things, but he was co-director of the St Magnus Festival, moved in 1993 to become general director of Opera North. But he also, and most particularly, he was associated with the Scottish Chamber Orchestra for those years, which we'll be covering. And of course, those were the years that Max, as he will explain, Max became associated with the Chamber Orchestra in much more depth and extent than before. I found it, looking at his biography, I found it fascinating that he's also a co-founder of Carnix & Co., which deals with the archaeology and reconstruction of ancient musical instruments, and I think also in the design and development of new instruments for musicians with disabilities to play. I think there are so many other things that I do encourage you to have a look at all that Ian has done, and because he has a website and is under his own name. Without further ado, I think I'll just pass over to Ian. Thank you, Ian.
Well, Richard, thank you very much. Nicholas also, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I jumped at the opportunity because I always love my reflections of those years when I was finding myself working particularly closely with Max. They were very happy times, if one keeps the rose-tinted spectacles on. And when they weren't happy, they were challenging and very exciting times, times of great change in the way in which music could be developed and indeed could be taught, and we made every effort to do so. So yes, we'll focus very much on that period of when I particularly got to know Max. Obviously, I was very aware of Max from my publishing days, but not being his publisher, I became more an audience member. And when I was appointed to the Scottish Chamber Orchestra back in 1984, what I found was an orchestra of interest and quality, but it was slightly incomplete. Only about 2/3 of the members of the orchestra actually lived there, and there were many sort of guest players that would come in and out to do things. And also, quite significantly, there was no principal conductor. It was a self-governing group, a bit like the London freelance orchestras, a peculiarly British structure for certain types of orchestra. But what I also was aware of was the fact that they had already a connection with Max, but only Max as the composer. They only in the previous year had been performing a piece called Sinfonietta Academica in partnership with University of Edinburgh, which was commemorating a very important anniversary, and also his symphonic work with Singer Into the Labyrinth had also come into their repertoire. So the orchestra was not a stranger to Max, the composer. When I arrived, it was actually in the middle of the Edinburgh Festival in August '84. And the very first concert, and I'm ashamed to say it was actually the very first concert I'd ever heard of the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, because at that point they weren't venturing much outside Scotland, unless one happened to be abroad and picked up on one or two of their tours. So I first heard them conducted by Hans Werner Hense. And it was a fascinating concert of his own music, of Haydn. I can't remember all the program, but it definitely planted an important seed, seeing a great composer actually at the helm of an orchestra, and an orchestra that was absolutely transfixed by the presence of the composer, and indeed the audience likewise. That was quite an important induction, that very first concert. And my immediate strategy was to see how we could, in the best possible way, bring composers into the heart of the of the life of this orchestra, which I was starting to manage. The other thing that happened absolutely immediately was that I set up something which we called the development program. It confused people because that has traditionally been used across the arts as a term meaning fundraising. People talk about development in terms of raising money. And I disliked the word being hijacked for something as specific and narrow as funding. And also, I was very conscious of the fact that this orchestra really needed to be given the opportunity to develop its programming, develop its artistic life, develop its social and educational role in the wider community, which was at that point something which was extremely undeveloped, pretty much everywhere. There was already a program underway for a couple of years with the Great London Sinfonietta, working in schools and so on. But a kind of social program that embraces the whole community and the not just the educational opportunities that were arising seemed to be very important. So we set up a development program, slightly against the tide because it hadn't been done before. We were told by the Scottish Arts Council that if we were to do this, which they didn't think was our business to, then we must show that we're not spending any of their grants doing it. And I took that as a very strange slap on the wrist, particularly as that tune changed dramatically in later years. And subsequently, you certainly couldn't get any public funding unless you were doing this work. But in those days, it was so new that we were told, well, we had to do so entirely under our own steam. And we actually had to prove in our accounts that we were not spending our grant on this work, which focused one's mind a bit. And in fact, it became a privately sponsored by the Scottish Post Office Board, who were rather wonderful and had a bit of a vision about the arts in the highways and byways of Scotland. I was saying, so we're just talking about arriving at the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, and the first move was to set up something we called the development program, which was actually essentially developing a social and community engagement program, which at that particular time was pretty new and unfamiliar territory. But I think this is a good point also to say what the other key decision that I felt necessary to take at that point with an orchestra that I think rather fortunately was not sort of encumbered with the presence of a principal conductor on the note paper or on the platform, although we were later to very much value the engagement of principal conductors. At that point, it was an empty page and in a sense an empty stage. Peter Maxwell Davies, Max, as we all know him, had already not worked as a conductor, but had already had a couple of his pieces played by the orchestra, and it became absolutely obvious that he could have a really important role. He hinted also about wanting to move out of London and settle permanently in Scotland. He already had his home in Orkney, but this was to follow with also a home in Edinburgh. To cut a long story short, I invited him to be what we call the associate composer conductor. This again was what I'd call a new old thing. A new thing in that there wasn't a post like that in our musical world at that particular point, and yet it was fundamentally what orchestras had grown up as from when they were when they emerged centuries ago. So the idea of there not being composer conductors, although as we know, there are many conductors who also compose, but people who actually have that important role as being composers and conductors for that particular ensemble and influence the development of that ensemble by being there, had kind of slightly frozen over in the 19th century when actually the profession of conducting was kind of inadvertently created. I think probably it was Wagner who sort of stepped back and said, of course I conduct, but I'm too busy doing other things and got somebody else to do it. And that sort of seemed to start a new profession going in parallel. And the balance of power I was already very aware of through my publishing days, and already having worked for the Chamber Orchestra and indeed with the City of London Festival before coming to Scotland. I was very aware that the balance of power had shifted away from the conductor, away actually from the orchestra in its membership in a sense, because balance of power shifted away from the composer is what I meant to say. Sorry, that's a correction. And had was very much it had shifted to conductors, with composers being sort of the invited guest as and when. So I wanted to try and change all of that. So the appointment of Max as associate composer conductor was something that was very important, fundamentally important. It was not a notepaper exercise at all. It was absolutely a vital move, because the very first thing that he then did is said, okay, I want to write you a symphony. And he wrote us his fourth symphony. It had to be commissioned, of course, and paid for. And at that point, having already noted that the Scottish Arts Council, which was an important funder for the orchestra, was certainly not going to have anything to do with the development program, that education and community outreach program that I was describing. Also, were not at that point providing funds specifically for commissions. That changed very soon, but at that particular point, we had to again find a way of getting new work paid for. And once again, it was the private sector. It was one of our commercial sponsors who saw this opportunity to have their name forever associated with a new work. In this case, the Fourth Symphony. The association of the name obviously not built into the title. It's there in the small print. Commissioned with the support of, and they were very happy with that. And also, it became well, that piece was actually given its very first performance in the Proms in London. It was a move that the commissioning of that work was a move which actually got the orchestra back into the public eye and back into being engaged in the Proms, because it was something that was really interesting. We could give the Proms a world premiere of a piece that would have its own life thereafter in and around Scotland, and it was a great thing also for the orchestra and its supporters, including its sponsors, to actually see this happening beyond the borders. So that was the very first thing that happened, and it was and it was good, but that was just in a way just a taster for the next big conversation. And we're now talking here about we're getting into 80, 85, 86 at this point, and Max then said, I would like to write you a series of concertos for the players in the orchestra. And it was just a wonderful session. And in discussing it with his management and all the rest of it, this was clearly going to be an absolutely enormous commitment over a long period of time. We were talking about 10 concertos, which initially would be created, developed, performed at the rate of 2 a year over a period, therefore, of 5 years. We said, right, well, let's try and do that. And several wonderful things happened. The first of which was going to a board meeting, and one of the new board members, an extremely important local politician from the Strathclyde region. He was their head of finance, but also a brilliant, a brilliant visionary man who went on afterwards actually to become quite an important MP that I then re-engaged with when he was working in the Labour government for overseas development, and he's that kind of person. But in this board meeting, he just put his hand up and said, "Okay, I think the Strathclyde region should sponsor these." And he was powerful enough to be able to say that and have it recorded in the minutes without even having had to go back to his fellow councillors. And so we actually, in a sense, had it in the bag. We had something in the bag. What we had was the cost of commissioning 10 concertos over 5 years in the bag. Well, that was a rather wonderful thing. What I suspect that wonderful colleague from Strathclyde region had already cottoned onto, but it didn't come up in that particular discussion, or indeed in that particular commitment of funding, was that this would go far beyond simply attaching the name of a local authority to a set of works. And indeed, the name of Strathclyde, because the region then got abolished rather tragically in political changes, and the name Strathclyde lives on through these concertos, and I think actually there's also somebody with a title in the House of Lords bearing that name as well. But essentially, I mean, the name lives on through that work. Anyway, what happened next was that the Scottish Arts Council were fascinated by this this project, this decision, and they got in touch and said, we would like to co-fund this commission. This was the first time in my life that an arts council has applied to me, not the other way around. And they simply wanted to put their money into this, and I was absolutely delighted to hear that. So I quickly got on the phone to the Strathclyde region and said, would you mind sharing the commission fees, the commissioning, with the Arts Council? So there's a partnership there and all the rest of it. But the remaining, the other half of the money, the equivalent, the same again, as it were, could go into developing work in in the various communities around Strathclyde. And that was when the idea was born that every single one of those concertos would be adopted by a different division of the region, a different group of schools. Generally, it would be maybe up to 3 secondary schools and then all the feeder primary schools in the different divisions of the region. So that during the course of the 10 concertos, every single school and a large proportion of the children being educated throughout the Strathclyde region, which is, by the way, 40% of the entire population of Scotland live in the Strathclyde region. So we're talking about 40% of Scotland's school children would have some kind of connection with this project, and each in a different division of the region, which had such interesting differences. So that took you into Ayrshire, and it took you into Argyll and Bute, the sort of Southern Highlands. It took you into extraordinary areas of great poverty and areas of great beauty, and very different communities around this very, very large area. And so it was born, and then the plan then emerged from that. And this is when actually my dear wife, Catherine Medall, comes into the picture here. She stays very much in the picture all the way through, because she wasn't my wife at that point, but she became the first development manager for the orchestra. This is using development in the right term. That means developing the orchestra, developing the community programs, developing the whole sort of connection that the orchestra could make with its community at large. And Catherine and I went off to visit Max and to say to him, look, we've got a proposal to make to Max. We want every single one of your concertos to become the core material for the development of music in education in the schools all around Strathclyde. And Max, being who he was and having that his own background in teaching, wanted to look into this in a very rigorous way. So it then led to a train journey together to University of York, where he had 1 or 2 colleagues that he really sort of trusted in this whole area of education and pedagogy and all the rest of it, and broadened the discussion just to look at this from every angle. So it was a very, very seriously sort of considered, thought through project. And Max's main concern was that he would not be able to spend 10 weeks at a time going into the schools, much as he'd love to, when he's actually writing the works. He would actually come in at the end. He'd come in at the beginning. He'd inspire, of course, but he couldn't actually do it. And so we very quickly came to a solution, which was that every single one of the concertos, all 10, would have a younger Scottish composer associated with it officially, who would then be responsible for leading the work in the schools. And this meant also encouraging the teachers to get engaged in this whole new creative agenda, which they had to, because this all coincided with another wonderful, helpful coincidence, which was in Scotland, a few years ahead of England and Wales in this respect. In Scotland, it became an official ingredient of the music curriculum in schools that composing, i.e. inventing, would be delivered alongside performing and listening. This was actually literally music to our ears, because actually what is music without composing? Performing and listening is one thing. It's the sort of education, unfortunately, I got when I was at school. But the real education of inventing, performing and listening was actually now official in Scotland. And so this actually put a new twist on this. And it meant that these young composers associated with each of the Strathclyde concertos would be mentoring teachers and helping them to overcome their very natural uncertainties and fears about this new obligation, this new strand of commitment in the curriculum, and that the orchestra and the players in the orchestra would come in behind this and help and support the process of this new strand of educational activity. So the upshot was that we then had to identify these composers, which luckily turned out to be not that difficult. There was a burgeoning group of really good, interesting composers with to differing degrees, but always some degree, a commitment to the community in which they were working, and understanding that there is something really important about sense of place and what in the process, and also a real sympathy for what was going on in the education system. The first was a composer called Bill Sweeney, who many of you will probably know. And for the second of the Strathclyde concertos, and I think this is the one I want to focus on a little bit, it was a very particularly beautiful concerto in the series. It was the cello concerto. And the second Strathclyde concerto was allocated by agreement with the local advisors in the system to the Ayrshire division, and completing, I think at that point, completing his PhD in Manchester was a young chap called James Macmillan, who was, I think, quite keen to become a composer, and we invited him back to Scotland to take on this role with the second Strathclyde concerto. So we're talking mid to late 80s here, and as you'd expect, Jimmy was a huge success in this. But the location was important because this was where he was born and brought up, this area. And I remember the culmination of the 10 weeks of the educational work, and part of the commission to the young composer was not only to introduce aspects of what Maxwell Davies had composed, but also introducing creative activity for which he or she, whichever the composer it was, and for that particular Strathclyde concerto, would also provide a sort of a framework within which the children could be creating their work and be helped in that process. And there would be a public event, a community concert, effectively, in which people of all ages, not only the school children but also the adults and the rest of it, would all contribute to this musical get-together with the full orchestra in tow. So what way that Jimmy Macmillan reacted to that was in a big sort of sports centre in Irvine in Ayrshire. He created a piece called Into the Ferment, still very much out there and played a lot, as a framework piece with the orchestral elements within which other elements could be created specifically with, for, and by the local community. There were layerings of difficulty, so that the more able musicians could have more difficult music to play, and all the rest of it. It was the whole purpose of this was to bring the educational process and the development of the ideas, also, and an understanding of the ideas that were with within the Strathclyde concerto as well, all together into a kind of local focus, where people were familiar, not the sort of the unfamiliar, slightly forbidding concert hall where the concerto would eventually have its premiere, but a local place that people knew, where they could share the work they created and celebrate the work they created with each other. Also, Max would turn up. There'd be some examples played from the concerto. The orchestra was there in its fullness, working with the local people. And then, at the end of all of that, 10 weeks, 12 weeks on, the development of the work in the school, the development of something shared in the community, an understanding of the Strathclyde concerto taken into the premiere. And this happened for all 10 concertos that premiered after a process like that in the City Hall in Glasgow. And of course, there was all the sort of civic pomp around a new work being and world premiere and all the rest of it. And the orchestra's subscribers and normal audience were there and all that finery. But packing out the hall were usually between 300 or 400 of the young people who'd actually engaged in the creative process. And one picked up this wonderful sort of things. Max was obviously conducting the concert. And I think in the case of the one with the Strathclyde Concerto No. 2, which was beautifully played by William Conway, the principal cellist, surrounding that, I remember there was a Schubert symphony. I think it might have been Schubert's Fifth. I can't remember what the rest of the program was, just off the top of my head. But I remember just hearing these kids coming out afterwards saying, "Yeah, I really love that piece. Yeah, it's great." Didn't understand the Schubert. And what we realized was that the real challenge was how to bring people, into an authentic engagement with the canon, with all the older music. The actual breaking of the ice through the brand new, through the creative process, and having something really exciting to listen to, was actually happening through the contemporary music. So it was turning so many preconceptions on its head. And another very important attribute in all of this is that there were more than 10 young composers engaged across this project, because in some of the more distant areas we had 2 working together. But there were all sorts of people got involved in this. Sally Beamish and others who and Nichols and others whose names now are much more familiar. But this is actually what got James Macmillan started. On the back of this project, he decided to come back and live in Scotland, and so he did. A couple of years later, we gave him a post with the orchestra of affiliate composer. He wasn't conducting at all at that point. And anyway, that Max's role was as the associate composer conductor, but we also had the luxury of James Macmillan as affiliate composer, again, at a point when things were really very much in the early stage for him. But he had kind of pop star status with all those kids, and this was all born out of Max's creating a series of concertos that became part of the education of so many people and became the inspiration for a generation of young composers who were finding their feet initially doing some of their first work in a community setting and not straight into the concert hall. And I think that's been really, really, really important. So we're talking about all of this in the context of the Scottish Chamber Orchestra. The Scottish Chamber Orchestra, in the first seasons that I was programming, we had Mitsuko Uchida come. We had some wonderful solo artists actually, but Mitsuko wanted to play all the Mozart concertos and direct them from the keyboard. And that gave us a very interesting challenge. It was a lovely challenge because it meant that the rest of the program had to be conducted by somebody else. And I used that opportunity to create the filling of a particularly good sandwich, it has to be said, of all the Mozart concertos. And for the filling, it would be a series of what I called the composer conducts. Obviously, to start with, it was Max. So Max's first outings in his association with the orchestra were performances of his works framed by Mozart concertos. But very soon it moved on to him conducting the other works like the Schubert I mentioned and quite a wide repertoire for chamber orchestra. But the composer conduct series ran on. We had Luciano Berio lined up to do one of the early ones. Unfortunately, he cancelled, but we had a jolly good replacement because Harry Birtwistle said, "Right, I'll do it." Not only did he say he'd do it, but he came along with a brand new piece that he'd written just for the strings of the orchestra. He said, "I got this idea when I was standing on Waterloo Station. I thought I'd write you a piece." And I mean, it's wonderful. The stuff that went on outside the offices of the various agents for some of these artists can be wonderful. I mean, Harry just decided that's what he would do. And as I'll just come to in a minute, Max also had moments like that where he worked outside the field of his management to get things he really wanted to happen. And anyway, so Harry Birtwistle was one of those. Andrei Panufnik, Witold Lutosławski, others too. And so it was rather exciting to have the Mozart concertos framing an opportunity for composers to present their work in that context. It broke the ice with our audiences, and that's what happened. So I'm running out of time. I should probably stop, shouldn't I?
Yes, I think so. Ian, you have so many things that you could tell us. I think it's we need to. We haven't even touched on this Magnus Festival yet.
No,
so
okay.
I think perhaps we'll need to get you back.
No, okay.
With Catherine perhaps as well, and
talk about it. Yeah.
Yes. But I think I mean it's now 10:10, so I think perhaps if I could ask you just to round up, please.
Okay, well, just to round up, so that's what happened. The orchestra was changed forever, and it was a composer that generated that change. And all I wanted to say is that what Max was standing for was that really important triangle that Britain had called the Holy Triangle of the composer, performer, and audience. And Max's festival bore out that commitment to audience as part of the music making process. His performing as a conductor with the orchestra bore out the performing aspect of it. And the St. Magnus Festival, there's a whole lot to say about that. And it was it was a very, very exciting time. When the festival celebrated its 10th anniversary, I think it was in 97, Max stood down as the artistic director, and I had the good fortune to work with two local people, Glenys Hughes, who was a music teacher in Kirkwall, and Archie Bevan, who was English teacher and I think also head teacher in Stromness, and George Mackay-Brown's literary executor. And the three of us became joint artistic director, the co-artistic directors for the festival for the next 8 years. Very exciting times. And the relationship that the orchestra had with the festival was a biennial residency, which led to some very exciting things. So more anon, and I dare say in the sort of Q&A context, we can touch on further of these things. And I'm sorry to rambled on, but there's rather a lot to share.
Yes, and I think we need to look at St. Magnus Festival at some point, because we've not even touched on that at all. Are there any quick questions for Ian before I move to Gillian? Yes, Nick.
Yeah, Ian, thank you very much for that really interesting talk. It felt that that there's definitely more that you need to say. So yeah, it'll be wonderful to hear your thoughts on the St. Magnus Festival as well. My question is very, very brief. It's you were talking about the social program that embraces the whole community, and this wasn't very popular in the early 1980s. I'm just wondering when this started to change, because I'm guessing it's the late 80s, 90s, because I worked myself as a young composer back in the 90s with Judith Weir at the CPSO. So that must have been 96, I think.
I think it was beginning.
When did it start to change?
It was beginning to happen at that time, and if one could describe it as snowballing, by the end of the 80s, you'd probably say that at least a dozen or more of the orchestras had some kind of official program and staff to support that. And then there was, I think, quite an important turning point. It's not by any means the only one. There are all sorts of factors, including, of course, the possibilities provided by the curriculum and the demands it would make on the creative aspect of it, which did crop up during right at the end of the 80s. I think it crept into the English and Welsh music curriculum, but sadly, events have changed dramatically in the years since. However, yes, there was the Association of British Orchestras, who actually I was chairing at the time, decided to commission Max. And again, this is a project that Catherine was involved in. We could talk about it another time, probably when we would speak to her about what happened next. But effectively, Max created a piece called The Turn of the Tide, which is a very good title because it had environmental issues which were visionary, but also was a turning tide in the way in which orchestras would behave. And this was a framework piece, again, within which each orchestra would take on a process in schools in which the work would be sort of fleshed out and completed through the efforts of children, very often working not only with animateurs within the orchestras, but also other composers getting involved, a little bit like that James McMillan piece I described to you. And this process, the Turn of the Tide, meant that 16 orchestras all gave premieres of this work that Max created, the framework turning into the full piece. And that was actually very, very strong. And on the back of that, one really felt a corner had been turned, that there was actually a very serious collective effort in the community, the association, literally of the British orchestras in all of this. And this was still way ahead of developments that were beginning to sort of creep up, in other parts of Europe and across in America and Canada, where it all started to get going probably in the 90s. So that's roughly the sort of time frame of all of this. It was a very important time.
Yes. No, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we must move on. It gives me an enormous pleasure to introduce Dame Gillian Whitehead, who many of you will know studied with Max, but there's a lot more to it than that. Gillian, of course, is a New Zealander and still lives in New Zealand, although she spent some years, I think almost more than a decade, but no doubt Gillian will enlighten us a bit further, in UK with studying with Max partly. She studied originally with Peter Sculthorpe, from 64 to 65, and then she attended Max's course in Adelaide in the mid 60s, and again I'm sure she'll talk a little bit about that. She came to London, and then after London, or for a few years in London, she went out to Portugal and Italy for a while. But she's, as you I'm sure aware, she's a prolific composer, has written in every genre that you can imagine. It would almost be invidious to pick out any particular works, but I will. She was composer in residence in 2000 and 2001 with the Auckland Philharmonic, and she wrote The Improbable Ordered Dance, and then which was awarded one of the prizes which New Zealand offers. She also wrote Alice for them, which was for mezzo-soprano and orchestra. She's written at least one, I think, several operas, including one which is called Outrageous Fortune. I wonder where that title it relates to. But she became a dame in 2009, having been awarded the previous year the Distinguished Companion of New Zealand Order, which is one of New Zealand's highest awards. She has many awards, and I think that I can do no more than say welcome, Gillian, and we're looking forward to what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Good. Okay. I thought I'd write things down because otherwise I tend to waffle somewhat. So Just the other day, I was in contact with my compatriot, Lyle Cresswell, and we were trying to remember the details of the Musica Nova conference in Glasgow around 1973, where we first met. Now, we'd heard of each other and wanted to meet, but looking back at that conference, our memories differ greatly. Lyle knew Max Davies was there. I knew he wasn't. Lyle said Max's Stone Litany was performed there. I certainly remember hearing the performance, but not where or when it took place. We both remember that Berio was supposed to be there, but wasn't. He obviously repeated that some years later, although his piece still was performed. Lyle and I spent much of the conference asking various people if we knew the other, and we met up on the last day of the conference. Lyle said, I thought from his name he was a girl. I don't remember that at all. But 50 years later, what is certain about that event is not the details of the conference, either absorbed into the subconscious or overridden by other stuff, but that Lyle and I met each other there and Berio wasn't there. So fact becomes memory, and memory becomes set in stone as myth. And in this talk, I'm looking back 55 years, so expect some inaccuracies. In 1962, I was studying composition at the University of Auckland with Ron Tremaine, a good composer and excellent teacher. One day he came excitedly into the class, waving the score of a choral piece, which he'd just received and which we proceeded to look at in some detail. It was an intriguing piece written by a composer who had been a fellow student with Ron in Petrassi's class in Rome. It was, of course, O Magnum Mysterium. 3 years later, in 1965, I was in the middle of an MMUS at Sydney University. A UNESCO seminar on school music was held for 10 days there. There were 2 guest lecturers from the States and 2 from England, Wilfred Mellors, who was just setting up the course at York, and Max. There was a performance of Max's piece, The Shepherd's Calendar, setting of poetry by the 19th century John Clare, which Max had written specially for the occasion, and various talks and discussions. Max talked eloquently and in detail, mainly about his experiences lecturing at Cirencester. But rather than going into details about that, as I still have the proceedings from the seminar, I've sent a copy to the research network. I don't know whether it's arrived or not. I'm going to quote one thing, though, from his talk on teaching at Cirencester. Max was talking about problems with music written for school orchestras. He says, I had sent off to the music publishers for suitable material for a beginning school orchestra. The nonsense which came back was of 2 sorts. The first sort was music arranged for string orchestra by people who obviously knew nothing about it, i.e. they would write difficult positions for the second violins, sometimes trills and baroque cadences, for instance. What nonsense. And I remember one notorious score, which I got from a publisher who will be nameless, although he's very famous, with horns and E. It just hadn't occurred to the man who arranged it that horns have got valves these days. The second sort of nonsense was music especially written for school orchestras, the Fairy Glen elfin dance sort of nonsense. Well, I feel sorry for any child whose real world that is, so I packed it up and sent it back to the publisher with a polite note. A few years later, shortly after Boosie's had become Max's publisher, I had a job for a few months in their accounts department and had cause to open the Cirencester file. There was a very sniffy letter from Max about the ignorance of composers writing for horns and E, and someone had written on the letter, "Who on earth is this? Is he one of the students?" The following year, Max was invited to the Elder Conservatorium in Adelaide to teach for 2 terms, and in the break between terms, He came to Sydney and gave a week of analysis classes on Bach inventions and other works, the same works he was teaching in Adelaide. And I realised that the way he was looking at scores was the in-depth approach I was lacking and was looking for. I also organised a session with him to look at some of my scores. And when I went to see him, I had a strange feeling. I trust you. If you tell me to give all this away, I will. But he didn't. He identified the two things that concerned me that no one else had ever mentioned. One was how to structure a piece organically, rather than writing 2 minutes of this, followed by 2 minutes of that, followed by 2 minutes of something else, then probably reversing the procedure to make an arch. It sounded okay, but I knew it wasn't anchored in any way, and there was no way I could build on that technique. The other, on a micro level, was why to use this particular note here, and what are the implications of using it. I found that in that first hour, or however long the session was, I learned more than in all my time at university. I asked him if I could study with him in Adelaide. He agreed, so I moved there for the next term. There were 5 of us on the course: Graham Hare, Ross Edwards, Martin Wesley Smith, Graham Dudley, and myself, who all in due course went on to work as professional composers and teachers and musicians. Once a week, we would all meet with Max in a 3-hour class with a number of observers. The classes focused mainly on analysis and exercises to develop compositional techniques. In the analysis class during the first term, the group had looked at some of Bach's inventions and Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And in the second term, we looked at Mahler's Third, Pierrot Lunaire, and Boulet's analysis of the Rite of Spring. I found the other day the set of 2-part inventions I'd been using back then with a marked up score from Max, which applies to the inventions, but surely to all significant work. He said, what is implicit in a work of art is made explicit only at the end. What is implicit in a work of art is made explicit only at the end. We were looking for the deeper underlying structures, consciously or unconsciously constructed, to see how they held a piece of music together. What emerged from exploring the Mahler was, of course, the overwhelming unity of the work and how that underlying unity enables the passion of the music to speak. In Max's teaching, he would draw on a wide range of references which gave insight into the music: European architecture, painting, sculpture, history, which was particularly interesting to those of us in our part of the world, because our perspectives on architecture, painting, sculpture, and history, although with Europe in the background, they are really quite different. Looking at the Boulet's analysis of the Rite, which Max felt was somewhat lacking, gave insights into both Stravinsky and Boulet's. And I remember Max saying that analysis usually tells you much more about the analyst than the subject. The technical exercises were largely to do with rhythm. He would put up an unlikely unmusical rhythm, say a quaver followed by a semi-breve, then a couple of semiquavers, a dotted minim, a demi-semiquaver, and a crotchet, something quite illogical, and ask us to express it in triplets or quintuplets, or to write something for 2 instruments where one retrograded the other, and a percussion part using the same durations was added in the proportion of 3:2, or patterns of permutation. These exercises I found really stimulating and helpful. His teaching often drew on the pieces he was writing and exploring at the time. I remember him giving examples from Revelation and 4, I think in relation to melodic lines in Pierrot Lunaire. But he was certainly exploring extensions of cantus firmus, isorhythm and mensural canons, as well as bell ringing patterns in his music around that time. We also had individual sessions every week. I started work on my first commission piece, which I called Fantasia on 3 notes, where the form and the detail were based on 3 notes and 3 durations. and for the first time I was writing a piece whose form satisfied me. Max said very little about the process of the work, but a great deal about notation and how to notate complex ideas clearly. Most New Zealand composers back then had fairly illegible handwriting, and I was pointed to the scores of Debussy and Liszt as composers whose scores were clearly notated. And obviously, the more clearly you notate, the more complex your thought processes can be, and the more simply expressed. There were other things as well, of course. I remember him saying once, when there was an awkward spot in a piece, devise 30 ways of resolving that problem, which was a useful way of freeing your mind. I also remember him saying once, in relation to what I don't know, that he'd let somebody flounder for a while before throwing them a lifeline. Max had support from some of the Adelaide Conservatorium staff, but by and large, the staff were not overly impressed by challenging visiting composers and their gaggle of students. So the 6 of us formed quite a tight group. We'd often eat together, spend time together, or gather at Max's flat. I was amazed by how small town Adelaide was when I realised after a few weeks all the taxi drivers knew where I lived. At my last lesson, I asked Max if he took students in Britain. He said he hadn't. I said if I came to London, could I study with him? He said yes. And as I'd nothing much more to do in Australia, the following January, I set off for Britain. This was a time that Max, after his time in Australia, he'd met up again with Mick Stowe in Perth and travelled back with him overland through Asia on his way back to Britain. And I remember him subsequently talking about the impression Asia had made on him and visiting the Burmese railway built by the prisoners of war, which had featured in the background of Stowe's recently published The Merry-Go-Round in the Sea. My arrival in Southampton in February of 1967 was truly unforgettable. Max came to meet me at the boat, and with other friends of his who became good friends, we travelled to his house, Barterstown, on the Wiltshire-Dorset border. And 2 days later, Max put on a sensational 10-course banquet with matching wines. Harrison Birtwistle had come over from the States, where he was on a Harkness Fellowship and was writing Punch and Judy at Princeton University. And he had come over to meet Stephen Prosslin and Noah Morris to talk about the opera, and also to plan the first concert to be given by the Puro Players later that year. It was an amazing arrival in a strange country. Although through the network of friends I saw quite a lot of Max, we met for a composition session every couple of months when I'd done a substantial amount of work. We'd sit down and talk for 2 or 3 hours, often over a meal and with a bottle of wine, about what I'd been looking at analytically and what I was writing and what he was writing and so on. He never took any payment for this. He said he would have, or he might have if I'd been on a grant, but as I wasn't, he wouldn't accept anything. He never criticised, but always treated what I'd written with respect, just suggesting things that would give greater clarity or effectiveness. Looking back on that time, he was mainly giving me confidence and encouraging me to strengthen my technique to enable me to follow my own course. He maybe saw better than me that, being a woman in a largely male world, and being partly of Maori descent, things mightn't be too easy for me in London. Although at one time or another I'd considered enrolling at a British university or studying further in Italy or the States, I figured that, through the teaching of both Tremaine and Max as students of Petrassi, I'd had a pretty good grounding in European teaching. And I felt that working through the implications of what I'd already learned would be enough to keep me occupied for a long time, which proved to be the case. The Puro Players gave their first performance as planned, playing Max's Antichrist, Pierre Lunaire, and Harry Birtwistle's Monodrama with a text by Stephen Prosslin. The violinist for that first concert was Sidney Mann, now Sidney Manovitz, who left the ensemble in the country and now lives in Dunedin in New Zealand, so I come across him from time to time. Still a very fine violinist. Harry conducted the first performance of Pierrot Lunaire, and as time went on, various performances happened around the country and elsewhere. Harry was living at the States at the time, occasionally returning to Britain, and not writing very much for the Pierrots, while Max was writing more substantial pieces for them. I remember Max being really quite nervous when he was going to conduct them in Pierrot for the first time. He was really was very nervous. And he came back after rehearsal over the moon because it had been such a great experience. The ensemble decided then that they wanted Max to be the permanent conductor of the group. And in time, James Murdoch came over from Australia to be the manager of the ensemble and of Max. And over time, the ensemble became the Fires of London with Max as the sole director. I went to the Dartington Summer School in 1968, where Max and Harry were running the composition course. I had a new piece, Pakurou, played by the Pierrot players, and didn't realise at the time what a prestigious place it was to have a performance. One important thing for me there was meeting two people who've become lifelong friends, Nicola Lefnu and Erica Fox. I remember somewhat naively after the performance asking Max why the women on the course had been so supportive after the concert and none of the men had even mentioned it. And he pointed out that men didn't like to see women doing better than they were. I don't know why that should have surprised me. I was getting the odd commission and grant. One grant took me to Portugal and Italy for 18 months. And in between times, I did occasional work as a music copyist, often in an emergency. One such emergency was 8 songs for a Mad King. Max had left writing the piece until the last minute. He told me he didn't really like the text and hadn't wanted to set it, so had put off writing it. With rehearsal starting the next week and the score only half finished, he asked me to do the parts. I looked at the score, which is unusual, graphic in places, and asked him to get 6 single-sided copies of the score from Davies. I did a literal cut and paste onto A3 paper, which wasn't straightforward as all the directions and rehearsal numbers and cues and so on had to be written in. And I whited out all the clarinet pitches, replacing them a tone higher, which the clarinetist, Alan Hacker, told me months and many performances later wasn't such a good idea, as the whiteout caught the stage lighting. I'd be working until 4 in the morning, and the next day Max would turn up with another couple of movements. The last instalment turned up on the day of the first rehearsal. Eventually, Davies did some proper parts. Another emergency was, I think it was a World's Bliss. It was one of the very big pieces anyway. The first rehearsal was on Monday and the parts were finished, but not corrected by late on Friday. I was asked to check the parts. There was no time to do a proper check. Steve Proslin and another friend of mine who happened to be staying, and I sat on a balcony in the sun above Camden Passage. We double-checked that one part was correct, as far as time signatures, directions, rehearsal figures, and so on were correct. Then I'd check one part against the correct part and call everything significant, like 4 bars of 3-4-5-8, double bar and rehearsal figure C at bar 45, poco più mosso at bar 46, and so on, while the others checked 2 parts at a time each. There were some mistakes. There were quite a few mistakes in the score. Not an unusual amount, but a number. The odd direction left out, the odd bar missed, and so on. So these were corrected. There was no possibility of checking the notes. We had to assume they were correct. I went to the rehearsal. I think there were a couple of minor errors we hadn't picked up, nothing serious. I said to whoever was at Davies, the corrections in the part must be put in the originals, as there were a number of errors. But they weren't corrected, and when the piece was to be revived a decade later, the performance had to be cancelled because the parts were wrong. One day, maybe in 1972, 71, 72, I was looking through a book by John Mitchell, A View Over Atlantis, and I came on the magic squares, in which, as you probably know, consecutive numbers are arranged in patterns so that the numbers add up vertically, horizontally, and diagonally to the same total. And I decided tentatively to try using these as a basis for a piece. This was a time when serialism had peaked, but before set theory had much influence. And composers were trying to find their individual ways through or out of the serial morass to find their own styles and voices. I found the squares fascinating in themselves. If you convert a square to pictures, allocating the consecutive numbers to the cycle of fourths or the semitonal scale, you get beautiful symmetries in the horizontals, verticals, diagonals, and circumference, if a square can have a circumference. Rows of perfect fourths, augmented thirds, diminished fourths, quite beautiful. I worked with one of the squares, the Square of the Sun, in an orchestral piece, which was a breakthrough piece for me, and Max found the potential of the square fascinating. You've even made me think, he said, and shortly after began working with the squares himself. The squares were the basis of my writing for the next couple of decades, as they were for Max, but we worked with them in quite different ways. As far as I'm aware, Max tended to use the squares mainly as a filter for material, whereas I used what was implicit in the square itself to form a structure that encompassed the entire piece. At some time, the lessons petered out, probably after I had a grant and spent 18 months in Portugal and Italy, although I know I had at least one session in Italy because I went to the station in Rome and left a folder containing several months' work on the magazine stand, got on the train, realised just before the train left and rushed back in a panic. Fortunately, the folder was still there. I came back to Britain when the Pierrots or Fires, can't remember which, played Parkeroo at the Queen Elizabeth Hall. I still saw a lot of Max for some years. During the time in the 70s, when he did a lot of international touring with the Fires, I would house sit or cat sit at Barterstown or Eccleffe Mill or in Fitzroy Square or Bunatoon. And after I left Britain in 1981, more by accident than design, we'd catch up whenever our paths could cross. The last time I saw him was in hospital, maybe a year before he died. So to sum up, I was very lucky to meet the right teacher at the right time. He pointed me in the right direction, but above all, he gave me encouragement and confidence to find my own way. He was unfailingly kind and supportive and a wonderful friend. If I'd not met him, would I have stayed with composing? Probably, but my work would probably have been very different. Thank you.
Gillian, thank you. You did say that you when you were talking to us last week that you actually would go up to Orkney and house sit while he was doing other things. Did you start doing that quite early on, or is that at the time, sort of in the mid-70s when it was much more established?
I think I started. It would have been in 74. Was the first time I went there, and if he was going to be away for a month or 6 weeks or 2 months, I would just go up and live on Hoy and occasionally go over to the mainland. And it was such an inspiring place to work. And I don't think I've ever been healthier than when I had to lug coal up from the bottom of the hill to light the fire or get firewood off the beach or whatever.
Before I ask for any other questions, can I just say that this magazine, which is produced by the New Zealand composers,
Oh, yes.
Panzona, the one I have in my hand here, Gillian has an article in it on the compositional application of magic squares, and I'm sure that if you want a copy of that, you just contact Canzona, and they'll send it to you. Well, you pay for it, of course.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that.
And to explore some of the things in more depth about the magic squares that Gillian has used. Can I invite you to ask any questions? Please just unmute yourselves and ask questions as you wish.
I have a question. Gillian, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. Such a fascinating talk. And I found it strangely moving, actually, the way that you were describing Max and remembering him. So thank you. I've got a million questions, but the one I'm really interested in is actually was listening to you talk about the 8 songs and your role in that. And you mentioned that Max didn't particularly like the text that much. I just wondered if you could just expand on that a little, please.
Well, it was just something he felt. I mean, I think he felt at the time that he felt he had an obligation to set it because it had been written by Mick Stowe, but he didn't like it very much and probably didn't quite know how to handle it. So he did what he did, and I mean, and it became the piece it was. But I'm sure he changed his mind later. But I think it took him out of his comfort zone and took him into a new world, actually.
Yes.
Michael.
Michael, yeah, I bet you've got something to say about the 8 songs.
Well, coming from someone who absolutely, loves the piece and was inspired by it and led me in all sorts of directions and talked to Max about the power of it. It was absolutely fascinating to hear that point in the creation of it. And I was going to ask, were you aware of any reflection that Max did on it sort of quite immediately? As soon as it was being performed, did he realize what he'd done, or did it take a while?
I expect it took a while. I mean, the performance was very tense, and I presume you heard that somebody, after the violin was crushed, somebody went out of the hall, slammed the door and shouting rubbish. And everyone was a bit shaken. And it was very powerful, that performance. But, before he wrote the piece, he couldn't work out how to do it. Then, as I say, moved outside his comfort zone and found a whole new way of doing things. Also, this first singer, and I don't think there's a recording of him, Roy Hart.
There is.
He could do all those trills. Well, is there a recording of it? Do you know? Oh, there is, yeah. Whereas everyone else who's done it has had to interpret it differently.
Yes, there were some issues, I think, subsequently about authorship, because Roy Hart made this assertion that it was partly existed because of what he could do. It was interesting that Max later in life saw that piece as a bit of a millstone in some respects, because it was so all pervasive.
Yes. So it's a piece that people can very easily react to, I think. So it's sort of very accessible to people. very accessible, very dark. But it does seem to be the piece that everybody knows, which is a pity.
But we partly picked up on some of the discussion on madness that was going on in literary circles at the time as well. So perhaps that was accidental, perhaps deliberate, but it did seem to tie into some of the discussions that took place at the time and subsequently about the nature of madness.
And I think the millstone was also to do with the sense of it being sensationalist and extravagant, as opposed to genuinely felt and intelligent and thought about and sympathetic and empathetic, which are the qualities that I think Max liked about it, but didn't like it just being a piece of fabulous entertainment, because it wasn't really meant to be like that.
I think you're absolutely right about that, because it is all those things. And you know, I've heard it done just histrionically, over the top and rubbish.
Sorry, do we have some more questions?
Just a very quick, okay.
Oh, no, it was just on the point of the 8 songs from Mad King. Gillian, do you know once Max did the music for The Devils and how much of a sensation there was about that film? Do you think that added to the possible frustration with the piece?
I'm just trying to think which came first. The Devils came first. I actually did a bit of copying from that, and I went to the recording session too, which was fun. Twiggy was there. She looked absolutely fantastic. The only person I ever saw who could really wear hot pants. But watching that, I saw that film just with the music and the film and no text, and that was amazing. I mean, adding the text ruined it, but just with the music and the film, it was wonderful. But yes, I'm sure it did. I mean, and the boyfriend as well.
The film was actually produced in 1971, but Max would obviously have written the music before then, but we don't know exactly when. I don't know. Nick, have you ever seen a score of The Devils with a
I've seen various materials in the British Library, but didn't he write The Devils? That was the first piece he wrote on Hoy when he occupied that doctor's house throughout the 1970 winter of 1970. So he would have written The Devils just after the 8 songs, but they undoubtedly linked in some way.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. That was when I was in Italy, and as soon as I came back from Italy, the 8 songs was recorded. The Devils was recorded, so that would have been 70, I think. Anyway. And 8 songs was obviously just before I went away to Italy. Yeah.
I think Roddy has got a question.
Yeah, hi, Ian and Gillian. Thanks so much for those talks and all the memories that you've shared with us. It's a really rich set of stories to get into there, and so many things I'd like to ask you. I mean, I guess one of the themes that joins together here is Max and music education. We've had kind of the association with the SCO and this big project in Strathclyde, and I didn't quite understand until today how the kind of political structure of the Strathclyde region mapped onto the 10 concerti and everything that kind of flowed from that. And then also the much more intimate, I guess, more traditional relationship we might think of in a university setting between composer and student. And I'm in a department here where Phil Grange has just retired, former student of Max, and Camden Reeves is Phil Grange's student. And so there's this sort of Maxwell Davies lineage in the way that composition is taught here. And they're always talking about technique. And when I go back to Max's essays, the word technique comes up again and again and again. And it's quite clear to me what that means in a university setting. But Ian, I was wondering, how does that filter through when you start working on a much bigger scale in what today we would call outreach? How does that idea of compositional technique filter through into that sort of work?
I mean, in short, and I guess there are many others in the room too who would be better qualified in some respects to answer the detail of this. But in short, there's the question of the techniques that are required if one's going through serious music education at secondary level with a view to taking it further. And then there is the other part, which has also played a big part, which was the engagement with everybody who were, complete classrooms of primary school children, and almost always being led by a teacher who actually didn't have full musical background, just some kind of general views about it. And so, in a way, the two very clear distinctions in what's intended here, and obviously education is a common is common to both, and learning is, but obviously from a technical point of view, a very different thing. So, for example, the basis on which the work would be carried out with the primary schools would be much more along quite simple sort of songwriting and creating ideas and very often a sort of collective technique of drawing ideas from everybody and getting a kind of consensual pulling together of something that is shared, and that's fine at one particular level. And then there's the other level where one really is getting some kind of good response and development among individuals in a classroom, where they're creating specific pieces with the help of this process. Both things were going on, but in a way, sort of very, very, very different things. And certainly back then in Scotland, there was a requirement to, at secondary level as well as primary level, for this to be included, but it was treated in very different ways. Interestingly, I touched on James McMillan earlier as the person that was sort of in a way assisting Max, not only with the second Stradivari concerto, but also with the Hoy Composers course, which we actually ran from the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, believe it or not, and that was very much about obviously that level was very much about the serious end of professional training to compose, but there was always an element built in about techniques that would also be able to be sort of shared with work in schools, and some people warm more to the in the sense the more academic sort of secondary school and specialist music pathway, and others felt very much at home with the more general creative processes with the much younger ones at primary school. So, putting it simply, they're just two rather different things, but they do interconnect, and they all belong to the general point about education and in the context of community engagement.
Thank you.
Richard, you're muted.
Sorry. Yes, thanks, Nick. Sorry. I was coughing, so I thought you wouldn't want to hear that. Gillian, you did say something, and this is only a comment, at one point. You said, Max said, what are the implications of using this note here? And that's what he said, that Petrassi said to him. That was one of Petrassi's teaching techniques, to say, why is that there? What is that for? So he obviously learned from Petrassi a method of interrogating composition.
Yes, well, from two people. My first composition lecturer in New Zealand was Ron Tremaine, and he and Max were fellow students with Petrassi. And I studied with Peter Sculthorpe as well, but I found that it was the way of Tremaine and Max that was the way my brain worked.
Sorry. Are there any other questions before we round off? As I notice it's now 11. Well, here it's 11.
I've just got one final quick one for Gillian. Gillian, you were talking earlier about Max teaching you how to, I've got it written down here, organic compositional approach, which to me sounds like it goes against a kind of a block-like Stravinskian structural technique, which we can see in the right, but also in symphonies of wind instruments, etc. I just wondered if you could just clarify that a little bit more, because obviously you've got that long-term harmonic planning in the symphonies with Max, and in the string quartets, that the big pieces. But as we know, and as Richard has written about, we do get sections which are very movements which are sectionalized, because he uses double bar lines quite frequently to demarcate those structural sections. So could you just tell us a little bit more about how he approached this organic technique, please?
I don't know. Just trying to think. Maybe that's more my interpretation of it. I mean, I'm thinking of the way I was writing before I started. Before I was studying with him, when things were much less thought through, and realizing that if you pare things down to the simpler something is, the more you can get out of it. That was what it meant to me. And if you limit yourself, is in this case to 3 notes and 3 durations, and work with that, and wrote one of the hardest piano pieces in existence, I would say. But I found, that because you're working like that, it has much more. It's much more organic.
Yes. No, it's fascinating, because at the time, I think this was around 67 when you came over, or was this Adelaide? I can't remember. It was around the mid-60s. That was the time he was writing, these big orchestral pieces, Second Taverner Fantasia, and moving on to World's. He was writing World's Bliss, actually. That was started in Adelaide, finished later on. So, yeah, no, it's fascinating what you're saying there, and how we can relate to what he was teaching you, and what we can actually hear and see in his own pieces at the time. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
So it just remains for me to thank Gillian very much, and Ian also very much for their contribution today. And we hope to see you again at some point, because I'm sure there are more things to talk about. I'll hand back to Nick, who'll tell you about the next event.
Yes, so very, very briefly, the next event will be on the 12th of November, and we have 2 more speakers lined up for you there as well. More details will be given out on the network email, and there's an in-person event, of course, if COVID stays away long enough, on the 4th of December at Cardiff University. And if you want to know a little bit more about that, then please do send me an email, and I can send on the details. But thank you so much. Thank you, Gillian. Thank you, Ian. Really, really 2 fascinating, brilliant talks today. And thank you all for attending, and stay well, and we'll see you at the next event. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Gillian. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Lovely to see you again.